How do you turn your Bitcoin stack into an infinite fiat machine so that you can spend your money and you can live your life without having to work all the time? You can work when you want to. If you don't want to, you don't have to work. You can use your Bitcoin, which you already accumulated and you worked for, to sustain your lifestyle. In this video, I want to go into this in depth. Let's get started. There's a concept in real estate called buy, borrow, die. So basically, you buy real estate, you borrow against it, and then you die. You never have to pay taxes on the cash flows because you borrowed the cash flow against the real estate property. Whoever posted this greater give a really great explanation here. So they buy an asset for $50 million. Let's say you buy a house for whatever price. Over time, the price keeps going up 8% per year. After 10 years, the asset now has a fair market value of $108 million. And Peter has a built in or unrealized capital gain of $58 million. But you see here that he just put cash into this asset. So his equity would be the total value of that asset, which is $108 million. And something that bothers me here is that with real estate, only the wealthy can do this. That's a big problem. So you can only do something like this if you have a certain amount of money. If you don't have, let's say, $100,000, how are you going to buy real estate? If you can't save $5,000 because you're barely making enough to make ends meet, then how are you going to even buy a property that's worth $100,000 with a 5% down payment? And the problem here is that real estate, this buy, borrow, die strategy, is not available to everyone. It's a great strategy, but it's only available to people who have enough capital to buy as much real estate as possible. So you can see here, if Peter sells this asset, it's a realization event and he'll be subject to income tax. So he has to pay taxes on selling. So he'll have to pay taxes on selling the asset. So if he sells it for $108 million, his capital gain was $58 million. So he'd have to pay taxes on that $58 million. Depending on where you are, where you live, the taxes are different. So I don't really like touching the taxes part. Depending on where you are, it may be a higher tax rate or a lower tax rate. But when you borrow against an asset, you don't have to pay any taxes. So that's the secret here. That's the cheat code that Bitcoin gives you. I made a video a couple of days ago about the cheat code that Bitcoin is as a wealth building asset. It's also a tax cheat code because you can apply the same strategy to Bitcoin. So if you sell the asset and you cash in on the gain, you'd have a tax liability of $17 million. So his after tax proceeds would be $91 million. So this is really interesting because the capital gains tax rate here would be 20%. The net investment income tax would be 3.8%. And there's a 5% income tax rate. So you'd have to apply all these taxes on the capital gain, and you lose a significant chunk of the wealth that you received. And one of the things that you have to remember here is that the price of this asset goes up because of inflation. You earned this $58 million because the wealth that you put into that asset has gone up in value. You bought an asset that increased in price because there's more dollars chasing that asset. There's a limited number of that asset available, and you bought one of those limited number of assets, and over time more and more fiat is chasing that asset. So the price of it went up because of inflation, because there's more and more dollars in the system, and now you're getting charged a tax because you try to get away from that inflation. So the wealthy understand this, the wealthy really get this. A lot of people say that the wealthy are evil, they're bad, they're terrible people. They're not. They just understand these things. They just understand that sometimes debt is a really good thing. If you have an asset that's growing very quickly compared to the interest rate that you're paying on that asset, then having debt is a good thing. If you have an asset that grows at 8% and you have an interest rate of 2% on the debt that you take against that asset, then why wouldn't you borrow against that asset? And this is one of the things that keeps people poor. They keep working for their money, they keep trying to create value, going to a job selling their time for money and then saving that money. And over time, they just give away their time, their value, their effort, their skills for pieces of paper instead of buying assets because they want to avoid risk, because they don't want to take the risk of buying a $50 million house or an asset because the value of that asset could go down. The wealthy understand that fiat currencies can be created out of nothing, and you can keep creating more and more of them. And the assets that they own take time, effort, energy to create, skills. They take all of that to create. And if they just hold on to fiat currencies, they know that the value of their fiat currency is going to decrease over time. So if Peter just held on to cash, his $50 million would have gone down to 40 to 20 to 10 to 5 in the equivalence of the value of it in the few years before. So let's say if you held cash for the last 50 years, the value of that cash would have probably dropped by 90%, maybe even 95 or even more, a massive percentage. And the reason for that is that more and more cash keeps getting added. The demand for that cash keeps being fulfilled. And there's no reason for the value of it to go up. More and more cash keeps being dumped on the market. And over time, it's just getting created faster and faster. So in this case, instead of selling this asset, the wealthy take advantage of the system where more and more cash can be created. They get a line of credit against their assets for a certain loan to value, and then they use that line of credit there, that loan, to pay for other things, to pay for new assets, to pay for their lifestyle. So we can see here the investment bank might give Peter a loan or line of credit of $97 million, a loan to value ratio of 90%, based on several conditions, including the loan slash line of credit is secured by the asset. In this case, the asset is your credit. If you can't pay back your line of credit, the bank expects that it can just sell the asset and it can get back its fiat. So it's if you borrow $97 million and you have the asset and you use it as collateral, the bank can take that asset and they can sell it into the market and it can make back its $97 million. So instead of selling it early, let's say instead of selling it here, Peter could have taken on this $97 million loan, done whatever he wants with it, and then let's say he defaults on the loan, he's going to lose the asset anyways. So in this case, even if he defaults on it, he's taken the chance of potentially turning this $97 million into a lot more money. And I think in most situations with the legacy financial system, this $97 million would have grown. Even if this person put this $97 million into just an index fund, it would have grown very quickly. It would have massively outpaced inflation. And then you can see here, now Peter has $97 million of cash to use as he pleases, and he paid no taxes. So he gets to keep the entire $97 million, plus he has the asset. He has the asset here, you can see. Usually these loans are interest only, so you don't even have to pay back the loan. Over time, as the value of your asset increases, you can take on bigger and bigger loans against that asset. It all just compounds, and it just gives you this power over the market that nobody else has. And then step 3 here, you can see die. Peter has been living off these asset-backed loans and lines of credit, and his asset has continued appreciating value. Let's say 35 years have passed. With an annual rate of return of 8%, the asset now has a fair market value of $740 million. Then Peter dies. When Peter dies, the basis of the asset is adjusted to the asset's fair market value at Peter's date of death. In other words, Peter's basis of $50 million in the asset is adjusted to $740 million. So now the estate can sell this asset basically tax free. So this entire the family here, whoever Peter passes these assets on to, they don't have to pay taxes either, because the tax system is designed in a way to benefit you if you own assets. If you own assets, you don't have to pay taxes because you can borrow money against them. Borrowing is not a taxable event in most countries. There are certain countries, maybe when you're watching this video, this changes, but at the time of this video, borrowing against your assets is not a taxable event in Canada, at least where I am. in the US, it's not a taxable event. So we can see here, Peter borrowed $97 million. He didn't even have to think about selling the asset. When he died, he had a $740 million asset to pass on to his estate, and they don't even have to pay taxes. So they can just sell the asset for $740 million, pay off his line of credit, and they're good to go. They can split $650 million or something, $647 million, whatever the number is. Peter's estate can use the cash to pay back the loans and lines of credit. He's paid no income tax, and his beneficiaries can now use the cash to buy assets and begin the buy, borrow, die cycle themselves. So, this is how the tax system is designed to keep the wealth with the wealthy. The poor can't access the system because they don't have enough cash to buy real estate. These people who take advantage of this strategy, they don't think the same way that poor people do. They think of money completely differently. They think of money as a means to an end. They think of paying for things as just an obstacle to getting everything that they want because they have these kinds of strategies to their advantage. Now, the good thing here is that with Bitcoin, you can either take advantage of this strategy while fiat survives, or when fiat eventually dies, I personally think that it will. Maybe I'm wrong here. I don't know, 20, 30 years from now, let's see. But I personally think that if fiat dies, you're not going to be able to do this with Bitcoin because you can't print Bitcoin. The only reason why you can do this with fiat is because you can print more fiat. So we can see here, buy, borrow, die in the real world. Actual buy, borrow, die planning is enormously complicated and it involves dozens of tools and techniques implemented over the course of many years. First, this type of planning is generally not economically feasible unless the taxpayer has a net worth exceeding around $300 million. So you can't do this, at least here, uh, unless you have a net worth exceeding $300 million. That's insane. If you're worth less than that, you're not going to be able to command attractive financial products from investment banks. You're going to have to get a plain vanilla product like a margin loan or a securities backed line of credit, like a HELOC, I guess, a home equity line of credit. And they have high interest rates. But the good thing here is that even if you do this as an individual who has uh, just a few properties, you don't have this high of an amount of wealth, you can still do it, but you're going to pay more in interest. You have to be more picky with the things that you buy. So in this case, in Bitcoin's case, because Bitcoin has such a high return, these high interest rates don't really affect you that much. Not as negatively, at least. Like with real estate, you're getting an 8% return. With Bitcoin, you can get a 20, 30, 40% return each year. So now let's take a look at the buy, borrow, die strategy in Bitcoin's context. So how does the buy, borrow, die strategy apply to Bitcoin instead of real estate? So if you don't want to buy real estate as an investment, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to. With Bitcoin, anybody can follow this strategy. Anybody can do this. Anybody can buy as much Bitcoin as they want to. And then eventually, the Bitcoin that they have will be worth something and they'll be able to borrow against it. And I think when we go through this strategy, it's going to break a lot of brains because most people don't look at money the way that the wealthy do. Most people look at money as something that they should hoard. They look at fiat currencies as something that they should hoard and they should put in their bank account and they should have as much of it as possible. And they should do whatever they can to get as much fiat as they possibly can. But I think that this strategy changes how you look at money. It changes how you look at fiat currencies. I think that this is a true speculative attack on fiat. The stronger that this strategy gets, and the more banks that offer this strategy to you. So let's say you can borrow money against your Bitcoin, you can borrow fiat against your Bitcoin, you can borrow US dollars, Canadian dollars, yen, won, whatever. You can borrow them against your Bitcoin. The stronger that Bitcoin gets, because more and more people become just diehard holders and they never have to sell, but the weaker that the fiat currency system gets because the cost of everything is going to rise even more. More and more people won't be able to afford the things that they need for their day to day expenditures. So, let's say, for example, steak, chicken, cheese, all these things are going to get so expensive that people are going to have to rely on fake products to just sustain their lifestyles. They're going to be relying on 3D printed steaks. Whatever people can make in factories, that's what they're going to be relying on. They're going to be relying on food that comes from an assembly line. If you look at Bitcoin this way, and if you have this ability to buy, borrow, and die, then you don't really have to look at the opportunity cost of buying the things that you want and selling your Bitcoin. Of course, this comes with some risks. And I talked about it in a post that I posted recently on YouTube. We can see that here. I used to hate the idea of borrowing against your Bitcoin, but I was presented with new information and completely changed my mind. I believe that if I'm presented with new information that makes sense to me, then I should use it in making my investment decisions. If I don't do that, then that's just me not doing the best that I can for my future self. So we can see here, I used to think that you should just sell your Bitcoin to buy the things that you need if you don't have enough income. And you can look at my other videos from before. I don't take them down. You can see the mistakes that I made before. I've changed my ideas, I've changed my thoughts over time. I used to think that you should sell your Bitcoin. You shouldn't borrow against it. But now I understand that most people won't care about Bitcoin until it's $1 million or more. And I think that's 100% true. I actually think that most people won't pay attention to it until it's $10 million or more. I think most people aren't going to pay attention to it unless they're earning Bitcoin from their jobs. And up until then, up until that point, most of the Bitcoin will be bought by institutions like MicroStrategy. The institutions that understand Bitcoin never sell. They understand this buy, borrow, die strategy. So why would they sell? They'll just borrow against their Bitcoin to pay for their operations, and they'll never have to sell it. They'll be able to keep that Bitcoin literally forever. For example, Strategy, they're building more and more products every day that allow them to basically print fiat by using their Bitcoin as their foundation. So from my perspective, the way that I see this is, why should I sell my Bitcoin to Strategy? Why should I sell my Bitcoin in order to sustain my lifestyle? Why wouldn't I use the buy, borrow, die strategy with Bitcoin now that lending with Bitcoin is becoming more and more widespread? Why should I have to pay the taxes from selling my Bitcoin? Why should I pay the fees for selling my Bitcoin? If somebody wants to be paid in Bitcoin, that's perfectly fine. I don't mind. I can pay them in Bitcoin. But most people don't want Bitcoin right now. Most people think it's a scam. They think it's a Ponzi scheme. So why should I give my Bitcoin away and pay taxes and have less Bitcoin in the future when I can just borrow against it? I can just borrow against a very small portion of my stack, take a very low risk loan, and over time just pay back that loan with devalued dollars, or never have to pay it back ever. I never have to pay that loan back because the loan to value will keep decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. And I'll explain what that means. It'll keep decreasing until that loan is basically 1% of my total collateral, then 0.5%, then 0.25%. And it keeps decreasing until I basically owe nothing. And if I have to, because the fiat currency's value will also have decreased in that time, I can pay back the loan with income from a job. And that would be income that I receive, let's say 10, 20, 30 years from now. So I can keep kicking the can down the road, just like the US government, and I can sustain my lifestyle. Of course, there are still risks associated with borrowing against your Bitcoin. I do understand that it's very volatile. You could be liquidated. I'll explain what that means as well. And this is why you should limit the amount that you borrow against your Bitcoin. The lower your LTV, the safer your loan. So the less your LTV is, if you borrow against a smaller amount of your stack, then your loan is safer because it's easier for you to recapitalize that loan because you have more of your stack still left over. So what I mean here is that, let's say you were to buy $100 worth of Bitcoin per month, and Bitcoin's price goes up at 25% per year. So over time, you're going to keep stacking more and more Bitcoin. After year one, you'd have 0.01 Bitcoin. After year two, you'd have 0.018. After year three, you'd have 0.024, and so on until, let's say, 2035, 10 years from now, you'd have 0.0448 Bitcoin. So 4.48 million Satoshis. At that time, it's only worth $50,000. But with your $50,000, you'd be able to take a loan, a very, very low risk loan of $1,200. If you want to take a little bit more risk, you could take a loan of $5,000. So you could borrow against 20% of your stack, 50% loan to value, So you could borrow against 10, basically 10% of your stack. You can borrow that amount. So you'd be able to borrow $5,000 almost. If you keep going, you keep stacking until 2045, you'd have about 0.05 Bitcoin, 0.049, 4.9 million Satoshis worth $514,000. Keep in mind, at this point, you would have put in, so we'll go 20 years, you would have put in $24,000, but your Bitcoin would be worth $514,000. You could take a loan against that Bitcoin of $12,860 at a very, very low loan to value. So now I'll just go into what loan to value is. Your loan to value is basically just the loan divided by the Bitcoin collateral that you give to your lender. So let's say you borrow $30,000, you'd have to give them $60,000 worth of Bitcoin. Right now, Bitcoin is $120,000. So let's say you use 0.1 Bitcoin as collateral. That's $12,000 today. You could get a $6,000 loan against that Bitcoin, against that 0.1 Bitcoin, with a 50% loan to value. In this case, if your collateral goes down to $7,500, so if Bitcoin goes to $75,000, then you'd be liquidated. Part of your loan would be liquidated, and what your lender would do is they would sell some of your Bitcoin, and then they would apply that to your loan. So let me show you how that would work. You'd have to get to an 80% loan to value. So Bitcoin's price would have to drop to 10 times this, $75,000, and your Bitcoin collateral value would fall to 7,500, meaning your loan to value is now 80%. With the lender that I looked at, what they do is if your loan to value goes to 80%, they sell down some of your Bitcoin until you go back to 70%, and then they go through that process again. So in this case, let's say you have $7,500 worth of collateral. Maybe they'll sell $1,500 worth. So we'll go to 6,000 here, and then they'll apply that to your loan. So instead of having $6,000 owed, you'd go to 4,500 owed. But that would only get you to 75%. So they'll have to sell a little bit more. But you get the idea here. Let's say we go to 5,000 here. So they sell another 1,000, and then they apply that to your loan, which drops your amount of your loan to $3,500. So in this case, your loan to value would be 70%. You'd owe $3,500 on that loan. Your lender would have sold 33% of your stack. So you would have gone from $7,500 in Bitcoin collateral to $5,000 in Bitcoin collateral, and you would be in good standing for this loan. Okay, so now let's take a look at it from the other side, where Bitcoin's price, instead of going down, it goes up. So Bitcoin's price rises 50%. Instead of your collateral being worth $12,000, it's now worth $18,000 because Bitcoin's price goes up 50%. Now your loan is only 33% of your collateral. And from what I've seen, once your loan to value drops to 25%, you can add more to your loan. So you can take a bigger loan against your Bitcoin collateral. And now let's say Bitcoin's price doubles. So we get to that 25% loan to value. So we can see here that if Bitcoin's price goes to $240,000, your collateral goes to $24,000, which is 0.1 Bitcoin. Your loan to value has now gone to 25%. You can now withdraw $12,000 of this collateral, and you can move it back into your cold storage. So you can bring your Bitcoin collateral back down to $12,000 by taking out, let's say, 0.05 Bitcoin, putting it in your wallet, or you can leave that 0.1 Bitcoin there, and you can now take on a $12,000 loan. You can increase the value of your loan so that your loan to value is back to 50%. Now, I don't know which one you should do here. It depends on where in the cycle we are. Let's say if Bitcoin's price dips to $60,000, it falls 50% from here. Maybe at that point you could take on a bigger loan. But if Bitcoin's prices go straight up and there's like this blow off top, I wouldn't suggest taking on a bigger loan. So from that high of $240,000, if Bitcoin's price drops 37.5% to $150,000, again, this might be a little confusing. Your collateral value, which is 0.1 Bitcoin, drops to $15,000, and you could get liquidated. So part of your collateral has to get liquidated. Same situation as before. So let's say 33% of your collateral gets removed. So they sell $5,000 worth. They bring your collateral down to $10,000, and your loan goes down to $7,000 here because they applied $5,000 of your collateral. They sold some of your collateral. They put it into your loan. You're now down to a 70% loan to value. But keep in mind, when they do liquidate you, you have to pay taxes. So that's something you have to consider. You also have to consider that you're giving your Bitcoin to someone else, because if you hold on to it, they can't liquidate your Bitcoin. They can't sell your Bitcoin in case you can't pay back your loan. Let's say you get a fiat loan, they don't take your Bitcoin, you go to a different country, they can't chase you down, they lost money. So in that case, they have to hold your Bitcoin. And once your loan is paid back or once your LTV drops enough, you can take back some of your Bitcoin or all of your Bitcoin. And now let's take a look at another way for you to decrease your loan to value or to make your loan healthier, as they would say. So what you could do is instead of just letting your Bitcoin increase in value as you get paid, you could pay back some of your loan. So let's say you take $500 from your paycheck, you pay back $500 from your loan, you bring your loan down to $5,500. Now you can see your loan to value drop to 45%. And Bitcoin's price has to fall a lot more for you to be liquidated. So we'll go back to that. If you pay back $500 from your loan, you can see your liquidation price has decreased to $68,750. If you think that Bitcoin can't drop 80%, maybe your goal would be to pay down this loan until you have a 20% loan to value. So you could pay back $500 per month. After that second month, you'd have $5,000 left over. Then you pay back another month, you have 4,500 left over. Then you pay back another one, you have 3,500 left over. You keep going until you have 20% loan to value. So what would that be? That'd be, let's say, $2,400. So you could keep paying down your loan until you drop down to this value, and it's a very, very low likelihood that you get liquidated. Bitcoin's price would have to be $30,000 for you to be liquidated in this case. So in this case, if you don't think that Bitcoin's price could go to $30,000, then you may never have to pay back this loan. This is free money. You got it, they gave it to you, and now you never have to pay it back because you know that the asset that you have will keep increasing in value. And that's where we see that buy, borrow, die strategy. If you keep buying Bitcoin over time, you're going to have enough to take on loans. If you keep buying even like I said, $100 a month, if you buy $50 a month, you could do the same thing. $50 a month, in a few years, you'd have, in 10 years, you'd have $24,000 worth. In 20 years, you'd have $250,000 worth. In 30 years, you'd have $2.4 million worth. So in 2055, you could take on a loan for $60,000 with an extremely low loan to value. So if we go to your Bitcoin collateral, if we put in the full amount of your stack, $2.42 million. So we'll just put in $2.42 million. You could take on a loan for $50,000 and your loan to value would be 2%. If you take on a loan for $500,000, your loan to value is 20%. Think about the possibilities here. Think about where this could take you. A $500,000 loan, and all you put into Bitcoin at that point would have been, so we'll change this to 30 years. All you would have put into Bitcoin is $18,000, but now you can take on a loan for 500 grand. This changes everything. You can't do this with real estate. You can't put $100 into real estate every month. You could do it with a REIT, but you have to pay a massive amount of taxes because they're going to keep giving you distributions. You have to have your asset with somebody else the whole time. You can't take control of your asset. There are so many disadvantages to something like a REIT. With real estate in general, you can't get away with putting away $50 a month. With $50 a month with Bitcoin, by 2055, you have an asset portfolio that's worth $2.4 million. You could take on a $500,000 loan against that portfolio. I would say go a little bit more conservative, of course. Let's say if you want to go with 5% loan to value in this case, you could take on a loan for what is that? $125,000. You could take on a loan for $125,000, and over time, the value of your Bitcoin collateral is going to keep increasing. So by 2056, you have $3 million. By 2059, you have $5.9 million. By 2060, you have $7.3 million. And if you increase this even a little bit, so in this case, you'd have 0.025 Bitcoin, so 2.5 million Satoshis. And today that doesn't seem like a lot, but over time that will. Let's say you increase this to $200 per month. And you keep going. At some point, you will have that 0.1 Bitcoin. 2050, you'll have 0.1 Bitcoin. In 2050, you'd have $3.1 million worth of Bitcoin. And if we stay on a fiat currency standard, with that $3.1 million, you could take on a $200,000 loan, $200,000, and it would only be a 6.45% loan to value. So your loan would be extremely safe, but you got $200,000 out of your Bitcoin. I think that makes a lot of sense. To me, that makes a lot of sense. You could do this for any amount of Bitcoin. If you're a high wealth individual and you have a ton of wealth today and you don't want to put any money into Bitcoin, that's perfectly fine. What you could do is, let's say you have enough money to buy one whole Bitcoin today, and then you plan to never buy Bitcoin again. In 2045, you'd have $10 million worth of Bitcoin, $10.364 million. So let's put that number here, 10,364,000. Extend this a little bit and I'll zoom in. $10.3 million worth of Bitcoin. You can get a $200,000 loan with a 2% loan to value. Bitcoin's price would have to fall 98% for you to be completely screwed. And I don't think that's going to happen. So in this case, if you have the wealth to buy one Bitcoin today, in 2045, you'd be able to give your bank 3.8 million Satoshis, 0.03859 Bitcoin, and you'd be able to get a $200,000 loan against that Bitcoin. $200,000 at 50% loan to value. This is crazy. Once you grasp this, it makes no sense to buy anything else because nothing else can grow as fast as Bitcoin. And keep in mind that this is with very conservative growth rates. I think that 25% is extremely conservative. I think the US dollar can lose way more than 20% per year, meaning that Bitcoin can grow at more than 25%. So if Bitcoin grows at 35% per year, you can see how the numbers change. If you have one Bitcoin, by 2040, so 5 years sooner, you could take on that same loan, the same loan with only 827,000 Satoshis in 2045. You went from 3.8 million Satoshis as your collateral to 827,000 Satoshis. So if you can get to these points, if you can get to 0.1 Bitcoin, if you can get to 1 Bitcoin, if you can get to half a Bitcoin, get there. Because getting there is the hard part. Once you do get there, though, your banks are going to line up to give you fiat because they're going to need more people to be consumers to spend in the system so that the system doesn't collapse. Bitcoiners are going to be the ones who get the best treatment. They're going to get royal treatment from banks because banks will need collateral to create more fiat. Banks will know that Bitcoin's price is going to continue to rise in terms of fiat because fiat can be created out of nothing. And you can take advantage of that. You can use that system to your advantage by just buying Bitcoin. That's it. You can create that buy, borrow, die strategy for yourself. You can turn your Bitcoin stack into an infinite money machine. You never have to sell your Bitcoin. Of course, there is some risk where you could get liquidated. I acknowledge that. You should look into that. That is something really important to understand. But once you get through that, you can understand that taking on a very small loan against your Bitcoin makes a lot of sense. I didn't think of it before. I didn't see it that way before, but taking on a small loan against your Bitcoin does make sense. At least I think that way. Because if you were to sell your Bitcoin, then you can only consume with it once. With a loan, if Bitcoin's price keeps going up, you can keep getting more and more money out of your Bitcoin. So if you buy 0.1 Bitcoin today with $11,950 and you just keep stacking over time, let's actually add that on here as well. So you buy 0.1 Bitcoin today and then you keep adding, let's say $250 a month. And let's say your expenses today are $5,000. Your expenses will keep going up. In terms of fiat, they'll keep rising, but the amount of fiat that you can borrow against your stack will also keep rising. So by 2040, at that point, you'd have $2.1 million worth of Bitcoin. You can take on a loan of $52,000 at the conservative end, but if you want to go a little bit more risky, you could take on a loan of $210,000 against that Bitcoin. And that's only borrowing against 20% of your stack. So you're taking on a 50% loan to value and you're using 20% of your stack as collateral. That's wild. You get $210,000 without having to pay any taxes, and you still own the asset. That's wild. That's crazy. If you don't want to take advantage of this, I think you're going to be disappointed because you're going to give away your Bitcoin, you're going to sell your Bitcoin, and you're never going to be able to get it back at the same prices again. Selling your Bitcoin to pay for your expenses is, of course, the least risky way to do it because then you can't get liquidated. You can't have your Bitcoin taken from you. You still have full control of the rest of your stack. But I think this is really strong to consider. Over time, you're going to see that there are Bitcoin mortgages where you can't get liquidated as the financial industry figures out what Bitcoin is and they realize that Bitcoin's price only goes up, they're going to give you locked in rates for, let's say, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. They're going to allow you to borrow money and make payments over time because they thrive on payments. To them, they're just creating new fiat out of thin air and they're taking a certain amount of value out of the system through interest. So they want to continue doing that. Bitcoiners are giving them that opportunity. If you own Bitcoin, you can take advantage of that opportunity and you can use it to benefit yourself. You can use it to consume and to pay for the things that you want without having to worry about having to pay taxes, having to pay fees on your Bitcoin, having to deal with the opportunity of costs of not having your Bitcoin. Of course, at some point, that's not going to be the case anymore. When the world goes to a Bitcoin standard and we start using Bitcoin as money, at that point, you're not going to be able to borrow against your Bitcoin because Bitcoin will be in the place of fiat. And I strongly do think that that's where the world is going. So the best thing you can do here is buy Bitcoin, hold on to it, use it to your advantage, and of course, leave a thumbs up if you enjoy this content. Share it with other people. If you leave a thumbs up, YouTube pushes it to other people and it just widens the adoption of Bitcoin. Also, check out the Bitcoin Explained community. The link is in the description below. There's weekly live sessions. We talk about all this kind of stuff. If you want any specific answers to questions and you want to do it in a group session or you want to talk to other people, join the community. It's great. Group is growing. People are learning more and more. And one last thing here, if you want to book a one-on-one meeting with me, if you want to ask specific questions, if you want me to look through your finances, you can book a meeting with me in the link in the description below or in the pinned comment. There's a link there. Thank you so much for watching all the way till the end. Keep stacking Bitcoin. I think eventually you're going to see that it was the best decision that you ever made.